How do you explain the past 25 years of growth in Vietnam? How do you consider the next 25 years of growth? Why now is the important time for Vietnam to emerge? These are the key questions that Brooke Taylor and Sam Korsmo raised and try to answer in their book, Vietnam, Asia's Rising Star.
Our two guests today bring together nearly 60 years of experience living and working in Vietnam. They have read about and, more importantly, participated in the Vietnam growth story that has spanned the past 3 decades. Does Vietnam have what it takes to become Asia's next tiger economy? And if so, what factors will enable it to do so? Those are the vital questions Brooke Taylor and Sam Korsmo raised and try to find the answers through their book, Vietnam, Asia's Rising Star. And on this basis, they explore what Vietnam's future will be. And it's a great pleasure to have both of you here on Talk Vietnam for the very first time. Welcome to Talk Vietnam, Brooke and Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah. So can you share with us what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, so I think in my role at Vina Capital, I meet a lot of people from overseas, whether they're visiting students, MBA classes, or business people. And what I realized over the last 10 or so years is a lot of people come to Vietnam with preconceived ideas about the country that are often not correct. For example, you often hear Vietnam referred to as a war-ravaged country or still recovering from the war. You hear ideas around the role of a communist government and the lack of free market and enterprise and entrepreneurship in the country. And I felt that I realized through that it was necessary for someone to make an effort to define contemporary Vietnam today. Some of these ideas were perhaps correct a while ago, but they're no longer relevant to understanding Vietnam as it is today. Mm. And then as we embarked further on the book, we realized when talking and interviewing Vietnamese about their country, we realized that there was also a need for someone to write about the country for Vietnamese people as well. Mm-hmm. Most people in the country don't really understand what has happened in the country over the last 20 years. They see their lives changing, and they've obviously got much better and improved a lot. They've seen the poverty rates reduced significantly. But why has that happened? And will it continue? Will their lives continue to get better? So we wanted to put something together that really explained that and gave people confidence in the path forward for Vietnam.
Right. So really the targeted audience of you are foreigners and Vietnamese living in Vietnam.
Really, anyone who's interested in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. I mean, it has engagement in Vietnam, whether you're an overseas Vietnamese, a foreigner mm-hmm. investing in Vietnam, or a foreigner who likes pho and bánh mì, you know, from their own countries. But also, I guess we had a long discussion about exactly what do we want to write about here. And we agreed, after some time, we want to write about the future. Mm-hmm. Because there's plenty of data to show how over the past 25 years, Vietnam has been growing like this. And so we want to know, will it go for another 25 years? Mm-hmm. And so when you decide to write a book about the future, rather than the current mm-hmm. or historical, it's a little bit of a different challenge. Right. Because you have to come up with assumptions, you have to be able to look at data in a different way, you have to test certain things mm-hmm. to say, okay, where will Vietnam be in 25 years? Right.
Obviously, writing about the future is very challenging because no one can predict. I mean, we can predict, but no one knows exactly what the future holds. Exactly. So you use a special method or approach to foresee the future, right? So can you tell us your special method here?
Well, this book is all about a hypothesis, mm-hmm. and we test that hypothesis. And the hypothesis is Vietnam is a tiger economy, and will grow and develop in a way similar to how Taiwan and South Korea grew when they were tiger economies. Mm-hmm. So one, Vietnam is a tiger. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. Two, can Vietnam do what Taiwan and South Korea did 30 years ago? And so once we had established that is what we're going to test, we have to determine what does tiger economy mean. Right. So we came up with several metrics for that. The same metrics that Taiwan and South Korea had for them to be qualified as tiger economies. And then second is, well, can Vietnam do what Taiwan and South Korea did? And one of the ways we did that is we have 6 case studies in the book. And each case study was researched and written about a specific sector, for example, education, technology, role of women, infrastructure, agriculture, and then whether what's happening in that sector is proves the hypothesis, yes, Vietnam is a tiger and it's on track to do what Taiwan and South Korea did. So my effort in this was very much, I wanted to be like a scientist more than a writer or a researcher, but to be like a scientist and test that hypothesis constantly.
Does Vietnam have what it takes to become Asia's next tiger economy? And if so, what factors will enable it to do so? The authors of the book Asia's Rising Star test the hypotheses by evaluating how the country fares across specific metrics and comparing Vietnam's growth story with those of previous Asian tigers, South Korea, and Taiwan. The approach that the authors employ transcends normal academic discourse and disciplinary methodologies. They extrapolate key themes from Vietnam's geography, history, culture, and government to mold this overview. They then incorporate into their analysis the views of ordinary Vietnamese men and women they interviewed. This expanded interdisciplinary and eclectic approach provides a stimulating prologue to the main part of Vietnam, Asia's Rising Star. Vietnam, Asia's Rising Star concludes with a chapter entitled Vietnam in 2050, with a positive, forward-looking, and compelling account of the factors that will influence Vietnam's rise.
Can you give us an explanation of what tiger economy means?
So what we came up with were 6 separate metrics. One is numbers.
Right.
All the numbers, FDI, GDP, GDP per capita, household income, mean years of schooling, trade, exports, imports, so on, has to have grown for at least 10 years consistently, no dips. 10 years consistently up, that's one. Second would be manufacturing, exports. In manufacturing, there's increasingly higher value exports. So you start with shoes and garments, but you move up to furniture, food processing, electronic components, high tech. You move up in that capacity. Third was industrialization. And in our case, because Vietnam is not yet quite industrialized, so we separated that as the policies for industrialization are in place and infrastructure is being built. So it's not yet done, but it's being built. That's in the process of happening. Fourth was expertise, that Vietnamese who study abroad, come back, are put into positions of relevance. Fifth was markets, that for a Vietnam made product, there is a market for that product. And so Vietnam has numerous bilateral trade agreements around the world, so they can sell those products there. And the sixth one was leadership. And this was the more difficult one. And the leadership angle that we had was, is the leadership more of a meritocracy or more of an oligarchy? So our leaders rise to levels of leadership because of their qualities, because of their abilities, because of their skill sets, not because of the ties to the past or who their family is or something like that. So those were the 6 metrics that Vietnam had to meet to qualify to be called a tiger economy.
So it seems to me that you have an interdisciplinary approach.
Yes.
How does that approach help you to have a kind of bigger picture view and more appropriate view on the Vietnam situation?
The book pulls together a lot of ideas that people have individually researched but not pulled together as a basis for understanding economic growth. So often when we think about economic growth, we just look at the numbers and the metrics, large labour force, well-educated, low labour cost, all of those sorts of things in trade. But actually when you look around the world and focus just on the economic numbers, it doesn't seem to explain economic growth in many countries. If you looked at South Korea and you looked at population, for example, and labour cost, most people would say, no, they're not going to grow. Those countries weren't going to grow when we looked at them 40 years ago. There are other reasons why those countries grew. And that's what we wanted to draw out in the book. And we identified these as drivers in the book. They're like the strengths or weaknesses. For some companies, they're weaknesses. They're the things that can continue to ensure that the economy grows, notwithstanding there may be different factors impacting it or causing issue, like COVID or other things, or government policy maybe not going in the right direction, but the country keeps growing. And there's a lot of those drivers that we talk about. We look at international policy, geopolitics, the support and trade. We look at geography. I mentioned geography just now, but how much of an advantage it is for a country to be one landmass that is connected to the ocean, compared to, for example, Indonesia or the Philippines, which has thousands of islands, and trying to create wealth across a nation that has so many islands, making sure everybody's standards of living and prosperity grow, is extremely difficult if you're building a nation made of islands.
Right.
So Vietnam has this advantage that it's all connected, and logistically it's connected to ports. So people can, this helps with the development of the country. It helps with the movement of people around the country, a lot of factors that allow the country to grow evenly and sustainably.
I think the urbanization factor you mentioned in the book, the time to travel, for people to travel from one place to another is relatively short in Vietnam.
Particularly to travel where there is work, right? So the factories in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City are attracting people from throughout the country. That's much harder to do in other countries that are larger or fragmented.
Giving his speech at Columbia University, Party General Secretary To Lam stated that after nearly 80 years of national foundation and 40 years of reform, Vietnam is standing at a new historical starting point, a new era of the rise of the nation. The size of its economy and trade are in the top 40 and 20 in the world, respectively. The economy grew by 96 times between 1986 and 2023 and becomes a success story recognized by the United Nations in implementing the Millennium Development Goals. Vietnam is ranked 23rd among the world's top 30 exporting economies, and the IMF predicted that Vietnam would be among the top 20 fastest growing economies in 2024. According to World Bank, Vietnam is a remarkable development success story. Economic reforms since the launch of Đổi mới or renovation in 1986, coupled with beneficial global trends, have helped propel Vietnam from being one of the world's poorest nations to a middle-income economy in one generation. Vietnam aspires to become a high-income country by 2045. Achieving this goal will require an average annual per capita economic growth of about 6% for the next 20 years.
Party Chief To Lam gave a speech at the 79th session of the UN General Assembly. And in that speech, he emphasized one thing. This is now a new era for Vietnam, the era of the Vietnamese people's rise. So I think it resonates with what you said about it is now that Vietnamese people and Vietnam as a country, we should, still work and think at the present, but also plan for the future.
Absolutely. So, if you look at Vietnam, the GDP per capita has gone up 10 times in the last 20 years, multiplied by 10 times. The poverty rate has gone from 53% down to less than 3%. There's no other country in the world in the last 20 years that has transformed like that. And the country and everyone in it should take pride in what's been achieved. They should be proud of where we've got to, but also going forward, they should be very proud of what can come. And what we observed in our research is when countries become more wealthy and more prosperous, they have a bigger impact on global culture as well. And this is something that really excites me, and I think it's what you were sort of referring to in To Lam's speech, is that there's an exciting opportunity ahead for Vietnam to become more recognized internationally, whether it's on the sports field. I mean, one of the claims we make in our book is Vietnam could be hosting the Olympics by around 2050 or so. But we need to see the growth of Vietnamese brands, the spreading of Vietnamese food, and who knows, look at South Korea. They have Grammy Awards, they have #1 global hits. They've exported their culture very successfully. And I think Vietnam is primed to do that as well.
And Taiwan and South Korea had to face these same issues. Like, how do we build a global brand? So Samsung had to start somewhere, at Hyundai and TSMC and all these large brands. And on the Olympic thing, that kind of causes people to laugh. You know, the idea that Vietnam could possibly host the Olympic Games.
It's a symbolic thing.
It's symbolic, but it's also crazy thinking. However, so in 1964, Japan hosted the Olympic Games, the Tokyo Olympics. They were awarded the Olympic Games in 1959. That's when they submitted to the IOC their proposal, please choose us, and they were chosen, which would mean that they started the process of thinking about winning the Games maybe 1955. So think about that. That's only 10 years after the end of World War II.
Right.
In the case of Korea, they were awarded the 1988 Seoul Games in 1982, which would mean, give or take 1978, they had to get a group of Koreans together and said, hey guys, let's try to win the Olympic Games for South Korea. In 1978, in Seoul, South Korea.
Right.
And at that time,
Pretty early.
oh my gosh, it was, I'm sure, poorer on a per capita GDP basis, infrastructure, quality of life than Vietnam is today. So, you know, I think what I hope Mr. Lum's comment will inspire Vietnamese to do, among other things, is to start thinking big, saying to themselves, yes, we could actually host the Olympic Games in the future.
You have 6 different scenarios, right? Not scenarios, but big dreams.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, can you tell us? Hosting the Olympics and what else?
Getting into the World Cup, and guess what? The women have already done that.
Yeah.
The women have already done that.
So now it's the men's
now it's the men's turn to come in.
Okay.
An Academy Award-winning movie, something of V-pop, maybe a local BTS group.
Okay, like K-pop, right?
Yeah, like a K-pop, but V-pop. You know, through food, doing something in the food area that, you know, in the last year, Michelin has awarded 2 or 3 restaurants with stars for the first time. But these come with people saying, you know what, we can do this. It's a sense of self-confidence, a sense of pride, and a recognition that, well, that's going to take a lot of work.
Right.
And so we have to get started on this. Let's start now, you know?
Yeah.
We remember we did almost host a Formula One Grand Prix a few years ago.
Yeah.
That would have been an incredible milestone had it gone forward.
Right.
But it's those sorts of events that will attract a lot of attention to Vietnam, and we do expect that as the years pass by, we'll start to see more of that happening.
Brooke Taylor is a New Zealander who has been living and working in Vietnam since 1997. He has more than 30 years of finance and management experience. This includes 25 years in Vietnam and 17 years as the Chief Operating Officer and the CEO of Asset Management at Vina Capital, an investment management firm with more than $3.8 billion in assets under management in Vietnam.
The first time I came to Vietnam was in 1995. I was invited here by my company. It was an international accounting firm to teach the new graduates that they had recruited in 1994 and 95. I enjoyed the work that I was doing here, the people I was working with, and I found that my career developed very, very quickly, much faster than had I stayed back in New Zealand.
Sam Korsmo is an American who has been engaged with Vietnam since 1990 and lived and worked full-time in the country from 1993 to 2004, and again from 2018 to the present day. He wanted to learn how countries move from being totally closed to being active nation states in a globalized world. He found himself in the right place at the right time in Vietnam and did not need a PhD to learn how to be a good observer.
This is the first book I ever wrote, Saigon Stories, an oral history of Vietnamese families. And then this is the one that just came out. Well, there's a 20-year difference. There's a 20-year gap here, 24.
Your first book about Vietnam?
That's my first book ever, and it's about Vietnam. Because I'd studied about Vietnam for quite a while. My Vietnamese is pretty good, so I could do interviews to do all this.
Do you find writing about Vietnam easy or difficult?
I tell you, if you want to be a writer, Vietnam's a good place to be a writer.
Why so?
So many things to write about. It's a country going through change. It's a country that's growing.
So Brooke, since you have a background in business and you're working at the finance sector, so in your book there's a chapter talk about Vietnam in numbers, and then you said that it should start with people first. So can you tell us more about Vietnam in numbers?
When we talked about the people in that particular section, we were referring to what we describe as the economic model in Vietnam for growth, which is called the East Asia Development Model. Now, it's one of the things we wanted to do is explain to people that what's happening in Vietnam is not random. There's actually a model or methodology that's at play here, where the government introduces policies that stimulate growth within the economy by using its resources, such as the 100 million people in the country, the engagement through trade agreements, and attracting capital, mobilizing capital from state-owned enterprises, private sector, and the foreign sector. You put all those together, and you bring in technology and knowledge, and you create accelerated economic growth, which is leading to lower rates of poverty and an increase in GDP. So that's what we're referring to in terms of the people side of things. Now, that's the East Asia Development Model, and it's been applied in Vietnam for the last 30 years. And during the last 20 years, what we project in the model is that the economy has grown in the last 20 years at the rate of 6.23% per year on average.
Right.
So in the book we show that if we continue to project 6.32% ahead over the next 20 years or so, that will become a high-income nation in about 2042.
So that's even earlier than...
It's actually earlier
3 years
than
before the Prime Minister wants it to happen.
Okay.
But I think there's an important point with this, is it's probably not soon enough.
Yeah.
And that's getting to the second point that you raised perhaps as a concern, is that we actually have to grow the economy faster, faster than 7%, even up to 8%. And the reason is that, as we'll probably all observe, birth rates are declining in Vietnam. So the growth rate of the population is slowing, and the amount of people that can work will start to decline eventually. And that's called an aging population.
And that's why the 6.25%, 6.5%, maybe it's not fast enough, 7.5%, 8%.
Yeah.
And that's something that everyone can share in. Everyone can say, okay, hey, are we rich yet? Because we're getting old. and as the population continues to grow, we can look at the Philippines. It has 110 million people. Thailand, 75 million people. Indonesia with 240 million people. Well, how are they doing on the get rich before get old thing? And that's a very tangible goal that people can set out for.
Right. So what should people do from now until 2036? I think 2036 is the milestone when Vietnam starts to become an aging society.
Have babies. We could do that. Well, I think, say in just export manufacturing, move as quickly up that ladder as possible. Say no to purchase orders to make shoes because shoes don't have enough of a margin. Move up. So no, we want to move up. Someone else could make the shoes and garments. We're no longer a shoe and garment country. This is part of the pride thing, thinking big thing.
Right.
We want to do robotics. We want to take AI for what it can do for our country and make it something tremendous. We want to think big. And one of the examples we have in the book here is in the 1980s, the government of Taiwan made this big broadcast to the overseas Chinese world and said to the overseas Chinese outside of Taiwan, please come back to Taiwan and help us build a high-tech future. And so we'll give you visas, we'll give you housing, we'll give you bank accounts and jobs, and we'll set you up in research centers, think tank kind of environments. Just come back. We need you. This is the 1980s. And one of the persons that responded to that is a guy named Morris Chang, who got a...
TSMC.
TSMC.
Okay.
Very smart man. He got his bachelor's degree in, I think, in engineering from MIT, a master's in mechanical engineering from MIT, a PhD in electronical engineering from Stanford, and then worked for Texas Instruments. He was about 55 when he heeded that call and came back to Taiwan in 1987.
Yeah.
And his company was TSMC.
Right.
So this is something that the Vietnamese government can do today. Make
So
that
talents.
call.
Right.
Talent, ideas, big ideas, innovation, drive, will, and a little bit of capital. Because I think Brooke can address this more. I mean, which is more important, a really good idea or the capital to fund that idea?
I think we need both.
Well, if you have the great ideas, the capital will follow.
Exactly.
There's no shortage of capital in the world to fund good ideas.
The Politburo has recently issued a Resolution 57 on breakthrough development in science, technology, innovation, and national digital transformation. The Central Steering Committee, led by the General Secretary as its chair, was also established. This is a revolutionary strategic policy. The key highlights include allocating at least 15% of the national budget for scientific research, promoting public-private partnerships to develop strategic technologies. Towards 2030, Vietnam will be among top 3 countries in Southeast Asia and top 50 countries in the world in terms of digital competitiveness and e-government development indices. Among top 3 countries in Southeast Asia in terms of artificial intelligence research and development, high-tech exports account for at least 50% of total export value. The digital economy scale should reach at least 30% of GDP. International cooperation in training high-tech human resources and the contributions of overseas Vietnamese intellectuals will be crucial to achieving these goals. Dr. Lợi Nguyễn, whose technology company was acquired by the giant Marvell for $10 billion, expressed strong support for Vietnam's direction.
Dream big nữa là trong vòng 10 năm sau hoặc là 20 năm sau, Việt Nam sẽ thành một cái powerhouse semiconductor.
Mong muốn được trở về nước để xây dựng đất nước mình phát triển, cái mong mỏi đó là rất hợp lý. Các cái chính sách của nhà nước của Việt Nam thì cũng rất tạo điều kiện, rất ủng hộ để các bạn hoàn thành được cái mục tiêu này. Nhưng mà không phải là chỉ là về Việt Nam, nếu mà các bạn có những cái điều kiện tiếp tục học tập, làm đóng góp cho cái đất nước, kể cả các bạn đang học ở Hoa Kỳ, đóng góp cho Hoa Kỳ, chúng tôi cũng rất khuyến khích. Đấy, để mà làm sao chúng ta tiếp tục có cái tiếng nói chung, có cái thống nhất để mà đạt được cái mục tiêu cao nhất của đất nước, nhưng mà trong đó cũng có cái trách nhiệm đối với những cái vấn đề chung của quốc tế, của thế giới.
So, what are the conclusions?
We concluded that Vietnam is a tiger economy. Yes, it will become a high-income nation within the next 20 years.
One thing very unique about economic model for Vietnam is the market economy with the socialist characteristic. So what do you think of that?
Look, people sometimes get challenged by this as to what it means, and I've never really had a problem with it, because coming from New Zealand, we have a market economy, but we actually have a very socialist policy. It's a socialist democracy. So actually many of the policies that the government adopts are very supportive. They're socialist. We have free healthcare, free education, a range of other services. And in fact, there are many other economies in the world that are very, very successful today that reflect those values as well.
So is there anything about Vietnam that you think may work and maybe could be a good case study or lesson learned for other countries?
Oh, I think there's lots of things. Again, how does a country become rich? You know, if Vietnam does become rich or gets close to becoming rich, other countries can learn from that. But I think a very big lesson that can be learned by the rest of the world from Vietnam is how Vietnam will maintain this idea of bamboo diplomacy. How it can be a friend to both China and the U.S., and how well they do that, how well they grow their economy, maintain a stable society, maintain multiple relationships with countries around the world, military, political, trade, diplomatic, everything, while these things are happening. That takes a lot of political savviness, a lot of political smarts, a lot of really strong, well-educated, introspective foreign affairs people within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the embassies around the world. A clear example is former Secretary Châu meeting Joe Biden in, I think, September or October of last year, shaking hands, nice photo of him. 6 weeks later, meeting Xi Jinping. So the leaders of the two largest countries in the world came to Vietnam and sat down with the leadership of Vietnam and said, okay, let's talk, let's figure some things out. And in so many countries of the world, there's such fraught relations on a global stage for reasons of history, culture, religion, economics, trade, what have you, where bamboo diplomacy, this thing called bamboo diplomacy, is maybe a model to how do you survive and thrive in a country that's, in a world that's often in conflict, and pursue those relationships with China, with the US, with Japan, with Korea, in a manner that ensures safety and stability at home. That's a lesson that can be taught to the rest of the world.
The book launch of authors Brooke Taylor and Sam Korsmo in Hanoi garnered significant interest from readers. They were surprised by the authors' deep understanding of the Vietnamese people and Vietnam's economy.
Bản thân tôi là một doanh nhân, cũng khởi nghiệp được khoảng 15 năm và chúng tôi cũng gặp rất nhiều những cái thách thức trong Covid, trong suy thoái kinh tế. Nhưng khi chúng tôi đọc cuốn sách này và được trao đổi với tác giả thì chúng tôi tràn đầy một cái niềm tin, cái lạc quan rằng là chúng ta sẽ vượt qua khó khăn, rằng là chúng ta sẽ vượt qua cái suy thoái kinh tế và Việt Nam hoặc là các doanh nghiệp Việt Nam, các doanh nhân Việt Nam sẽ phát triển đúng với cái tiềm năng của quốc gia, của dân tộc.
Cuốn sách này nó sẽ tác động có 3 yếu tố rất là mình nghĩ là thú vị. Thứ nhất là tiếp cận những người trẻ. Người trẻ sẽ có một góc nhìn mới khi mà ở đó tác giả lại là người nước ngoài nói về đất nước mình mà mình trước đây mình còn chưa biết. Thứ hai nữa là những cái nhận định của những cái chuyên gia thì cũng đã nhận định rằng Việt Nam mình hoàn toàn có thể trở thành và đó là đích đến của một con rồng kinh tế. Cái thứ ba nữa là ở góc nhìn bản thân mình thì mình nghĩ rằng là mình cũng đang theo đuổi một con đường mới, một con đường mà ở đó sản phẩm Việt Nam, trí tuệ Việt Nam và những tinh hoa Việt Nam sẽ cất cánh, sẽ ra thế giới ở một tâm thế mới.
So, is there anything else about the book, maybe the most important takeaway or message that you want to deliver to the audience?
This is a book about Vietnam, of course, but it's also a book about how do countries become rich, you know, and maybe there's something in here that says, well, how can my country, how can my company become rich? How can my province become rich? I would hope that people view it in that way.
Look, I would say don't be afraid to read the book. We wrote this book for a very wide audience. And one of my staff read it and came back to me and said, oh, I'm so surprised. I enjoyed the book.
Your staff?
Yeah, but you know, that's what, you weren't going to enjoy the book, but I think what she was meaning was it was a book that she really didn't think she was going to relate to. It wasn't going to be interesting. But we did write it in a way we hope that a broad audience can understand it. So you don't have to be an economist.
Right.
You know, you don't have to be a university student. We want as many people to read and understand what's going on in Vietnam, take pride in what's happened and be optimistic about the future. So that's it. So don't be afraid to read the book. Give it a go. And
how do you think your 60 years, both of you, living and working in Vietnam, help contribute to the writing of this book and make it maybe very easy to understand and very informative for people to read, as you said?
Well, I think it was crucial. I mean, because we have perspectives that a journalist who's here for 3 or 4 years wouldn't have, or an economist that works for a multilateral and is assigned to a multilateral, say in Hanoi. The education's there, but the local knowledge isn't necessarily there. You know, I'm a writer, Brooke's a businessman. And we put together our minds here to say, okay, we've been here a long time. I speak Vietnamese, and you know, we know this country in a way that journalists get to know it, but often for a short period of time, then they go off to the next thing. Diplomats, they're here for a certain amount of time, and then they get their next posting.
Right.
You know, multilateral economist types are here for a short time, then they go off to the next posting. We live here, and
we've been patient observers of this country for a long
Yes.
time, right?
Right.
And I've heard people say, you know more about Vietnam than I do, sort of stuff. Or I learned something about Vietnam from you, which is like, well, how can that be? But I think as foreign observers, or in the country, we look at Vietnam a little bit differently, but at the same, and it's allowed us to distill it into this message.
So how has living in Vietnam changed your worldview? And what is it about Vietnam that keeps both of you here after so many years?
I want to continue being a writer. It's interesting. There's so many things here to write about. And it's a rare chance to be right in the middle of a country that's doing something hopefully quite fascinating. And even if it doesn't always work, it's still fascinating to watch and be part of.
Yeah. What about you, Brooke?
Look, business here is exciting, right? There is so much happening. Vina Capital, who I work with, is a wonderful company. I'm challenged every day. I enjoy that, you know. If I was working in another country, I think my job, there's no way it would be as interesting, as exciting as it is here. So to go to work each day, have new challenges, and also real purpose to make a difference.
Well, thank you so much to both of you, Sam and Brooke, for taking your time on Talk Vietnam and giving us very interesting and insightful knowledge about Vietnam. And I hope that your books will reach Vietnamese people, and I'm sure the Vietnamese people would love it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. For the readers of this book who have not yet visited Vietnam, through our discussion today, we hope we have convinced you to come and see for yourselves this exciting nation called Vietnam. For readers who have a history with Vietnam as native Vietnamese or foreigners who have lived, worked, or visited the country, we hope we have further convinced you of the need to join in the building of this nation and sharing its success. So thank you very much for watching, and see you again next time.